The year is 1998, the month of June 8th. A man leaves the presidential palace in the early hours of the morning to the nearby villa in Abuja. This is something he does regularly. He goes there to meet two Indian girls. However, this time, a few moments later, he gets a cardiac arrest and dies. The man that just died in the company of two concubines is General Sani Abacha, the president of the oil-rich West African country of Nigeria. Widely reviled, flamboyant, and extremely rich, his death sparked an outpouring of jubilation among the masses. Abacha was buried the next day without a state funeral or even an autopsy. The burial of Abacha didn't mark his end, but began events that still resonate with Nigeria today. Even in his absentia, his presence is still felt in the country and the continent. Sani Abacha is remembered for three things: his iron-fisted rule, conspiracies about his death, and extreme looting and corruption. We might say in his era, he was the greatest of all time. Abacha looted Nigeria's wealth with no mercy to what seemed more like an addiction or a chore to him. He stole so much that he had to be paid to steal the country's resources and wealth. Reports showed that he had stolen and hoarded approximately 5 to 6 billion US dollars, which is approximately 9 billion US dollars in today's money, with over 150 bank accounts all over the world in tax havens. After his burial, people started wondering what had happened to the billions of dollars the dictator had plundered. No doubt, Abacha died a very wealthy man, but even 5 billion is not that useful for a dead man, especially if he did not cover his tracks. So how did Abacha acquire all this money? How did he spend it, and what happened to it after his death? Here is the story of Abacha's billions. The story of Abacha's billions begins with his widow, Mariam Abacha, when a few days later, after his death, she felt it wasn't really safe to mourn the death of her husband from Nigeria. So she decided to take a trip to Saudi Arabia. While checking in at Kano Airport, police got suspicious about her 38 pieces of luggage. Upon investigating, they discovered the suitcases were stuffed with a lot of cash. And I mean a lot of cash. And so began one of the biggest searches of stolen loot the world has ever known. General Sani Abacha was 54 when he seized power in 1993. He had been instrumental in the military governments that had ruled Nigeria since 1983. He promised that there would be a transition to a civilian government, something common during coups across Africa. However, in no time, he forced Nigeria's 5 legal political parties to nominate him as the sole presidential candidate. Ruling Nigeria with an iron grip until his death in 1998, activists who criticized his regime were imprisoned for months, with some put to death. Abacha's regime came under fierce international criticism and isolation when he executed the popular playwright Ken Saro-Wiwa and 8 other activists who came to be known as the Ogoni 9. With no threat to his power and every hint of criticism subdued, the looting began. Now, before we get into the looting, you should understand that Abacha wasn't alone in this. He had the help of his children, his national security advisor, Ismaila Gwazo, and Abubakar Bagudu, his associate. Above all, international banks were the most important element among his allies. Well, you know you will not stash 5 billion US dollars in a home basement in Kano or Abuja. The methods of looting ranged from awarding state contracts to friends at highly inflated prices in the oil-rich country and then pocketing the difference. He demanded foreign companies pay huge kickbacks to operate in the country as well. What is surprising is how he would steal from the country's central bank. The amount stolen from the central bank alone was estimated to be 1.2 billion US dollars. And this is how it happened. Abacha would direct his national security advisor, Ismaila Gwazo, who doubled as his bagman, to present him with false funding requests for security operations or equipment, which he had the power to authorize. In one memo written to Abacha by Gwazo, he urgently demanded money from the Nigerian treasury to fight critics overseas. America has gone berserk and seems to leave no stone unturned in ridiculing this nation, wrote Ismail Gwazo in a 1994 memo asking 30 million US dollars to be wired to a Geneva account. Millions more were withdrawn in cash for covert operations and delivered in truckloads to Abacha and his associates from the central bank. At times, the funds were directly remitted in travelers' checks, and to avoid delays, cash was given by the Central Bank of Nigeria to Ismail Gwazo, who then took the money to General Sani Abacha's house. At the house, Mohammed Abacha, the dictator's old son, would wait to launder the money through Nigerian banks or by Nigerian or foreign businessmen to offshore accounts belonging to Mohammed Abacha, Abba Abacha, Abdul Qadir Abacha, and their associate Abubakar Atiku Bagudu. In a limited number of cases, 36 transfers, totaling $386 million, the monies were transferred directly from the Central Bank of Nigeria by wire to bank accounts abroad, held by offshore companies belonging to either members of the Abacha criminal organization or to the Nigerian or foreign businessmen, who then remitted the same sums to the members of the organization. For his benefit, Gwazo persuaded Abacha to let him flood the market with US dollars to maintain a stable exchange rate. Gwazo bought $100 million from the Central Bank of Nigeria at the official rate of 22 naira per dollar and sold at the market rate of 84 naira per dollar, keeping the profits for himself. Abacha's own son, Mohammed, and his businessman sidekick, Abubakar Bagudu, siphoned $66 million from the $111 million purchase of vaccines from the French firm Pasteur Miro. In one case, he was accused of getting $500 million from the state-owned steel plant. In another reported fraud scheme, Sani Abacha and his finance minister purchased a government debt from a company controlled by Bagudu and Sani Abacha's son, Mohammed Abacha, at greatly inflated prices, generating $282 million for the two men. In confidential records of a prison interview, Mohammed admitted that his father had given him $700 million in cash over a period of 2 years in bags and boxes. He said at one time he had $100 million in cash at his house in the capital, Abuja. The loot was so huge that Nigeria might have been too small to handle the stolen funds, ensure its safety and secrecy. Above all, he needed to create more space for more funds to be stolen in the future. Abacha, although spent some of the money, it was a tiny drop in the ocean. He stole more than he could spend. For example, he set up a peace foundation that costed him $5 million, intended to sell Abacha-themed televisions, sandals, rice, and soap. A sizable chunk of the cash was hoarded in offshore bank accounts waiting for the rainy days. Most of the assets were channeled abroad through simple bank transfers in checks or cash in countries like Austria, Bahamas, Brazil, Canada, Dubai, France, Germany, Hong Kong, Italy, Kenya, Lebanon, Liechtenstein, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, Sweden, Switzerland, UK, and the United States of America. Assets were paid into personal bank accounts held mainly by Nigerian or offshore companies with access available to Mr. Abacha, his family members, or close associates like Bagudu. In Switzerland alone, Abacha had over 140 accounts holding over $750 million in 11 banks. What is fascinating is that private Swiss bankers were even less discerning about their clientele. They drummed up business by sending accommodating agents to Nigeria who actively helped to carry suitcases full of cash. The Abacha family apparently liked the service as it eased their work to loot more funds. Geneva almost doubled as the Central Bank of Nigeria, only that Abacha was the account holder. In Liechtenstein, he had $100 million in 3 banks. In Luxembourg, he had $630 million. In UK, $450 million in 20 accounts in 11 banks. When Abacha died, cracks started to emerge in his criminal network. Perhaps this was due to the fact that Abacha's death was sudden, leaving little or no time to cover his tracks. Investigations into the Abacha affair started almost immediately after the death of the dictator on the 8th of June 1998. A special investigation panel was set up by his successor, General Abubakar Abdulsalami, to trace and recover the money that had been advanced for contracts that had not been executed, whose prices were overinflated and withdrawn for whatever purposes, but was misapplied. Just weeks after the commencement of the investigations, details began to filter out. On the 6th of September 1998, General Abubakar announced that the investigators had uncovered 130 bank accounts in 50 foreign and local banks, where billions stolen from the Central Bank of Nigeria were kept. Abacha's national security advisor also told the investigators he had helped the dictator collect a total sum of $456 million from the Central Bank of Nigeria between June 1996 and October 1997. By the time he left office in May 1999, General Abubakar had overseen the retrieval of $825 million from the Abacha family, while $1.3 billion had been frozen in Switzerland, Luxembourg, and Liechtenstein. The criminal origin of the assets was also confirmed. Kickbacks paid by the multinationals, especially oil companies, contracts for supplies or construction works awarded at inflated costs to firms linked to the dictator, and direct withdrawals from the Central Bank of Nigeria for purchases, jobs, and services that were never performed. Abacha and members of his kitchen cabinet stole at least $2 billion from the Central Bank of Nigeria alone. However, the Abubakar administration invested little energy or capital in the asset recovery exercise. Apart from seizing assets held within Nigeria, publishing a list of foreign bank accounts used to stash the stolen funds, and writing to some heads of government urging them to support efforts to recoup assets kept within their countries, the regime made little effort to recover Abacha's $5 to $6 billion overseas. It also failed to raise the issue of assets looted under previous regimes, some more corrupt than Abacha. A case in point, Ibrahim Babangida's regime. Nevertheless, it must be noted that Abubakar's administration was preoccupied with other pressing domestic challenges, such as the speedy return to democracy and the end of Nigeria's international isolation, all in the limited time frame of 1 year from June 1998 to May 1999. The 29th of May 1999 saw the coming of President Olusegun Obasanjo, who put Nigeria's asset recovery into overdrive from a locally based initiative to an international campaign targeting several Western financial centers holding Abacha's stolen funds. On arrival in office, Obasanjo wrote to these several countries, including the leaders of the G7, to request their support in retrieving Nigerian assets held abroad. Within 1 year, the amount frozen in foreign accounts rose from $1.3 billion to $1.9 billion. In subsequent years, however, limited success was recorded in the actual repatriation of these funds. Out of the $5 billion allegedly transferred by Abacha, Obasanjo only managed to recover $1.2 billion after 8 years in power. Worse still, this amount came from the Abacha family, who had struck a deal with the government to release Mohammed Abacha. Mohammed Sani Abacha had been indicted in Switzerland for taking part in a criminal organization, money laundering, and fraud. He was held in Kirikiri prison in Lagos, charged with the murder of one of the wives of Chief Mashood Abiola, the winner of the 1993 presidential elections, who had died in prison. In addition to Mohammed's freedom, the family was also allowed to keep $100 million considered to have been gained before the late general seized power in 1993. On the 18th of May 2003, Abubakar Bagudu was arrested in Houston, Texas, at the request of Jazzy, who sought his extradition on the 18th of July 2003. Bagudu eventually reached a settlement, agreeing to return $160 million of the stolen funds in exchange for his deportation to Nigeria to face trial. Despite the considerable evidence from the legal authorities in the US, Jersey, and Switzerland, Bagudu was never questioned after returning to Nigeria. And then there was the international banks. Locating the money was easy, but repatriating it from Western banks was a different ballgame altogether. However, progress was made. In 2006, Swiss authorities returned $500 million to Nigeria, the first time European banks had returned looted money to an African country after a landmark ruling. The ruling also forced the tax haven to relax banking secrecy regulations. By 2018, the amount Switzerland had returned to Nigeria had reached more than $1 billion. In June 2014, Liechtenstein did eventually send Nigeria $277 million after a long battle of hide and seek. 6 years later, in May 2020, $311 million held in accounts based in the Channel Island of Jersey was also returned to Nigeria. This only came after Nigerian authorities agreed that the money would be used specifically to help finance the construction of the second Niger Bridge, the Lagos-Ibadan Express Highway, and the Abuja-Kano Road. In August 2020, Ireland signed a deal to return €5.5 million of the stolen loot to Nigeria. However, the case of the United Kingdom, the preferred destination for stolen assets from Nigeria after Switzerland, is even more perplexing. In the wake of the Abacha scandal, the Financial Services Authority, the regulator of British banks, conducted an inquiry which confirmed that 23 British banks had received over £900 million linked to Abacha between 1996 and 2000. Yet, none of these 23 banks were publicly identified, let alone penalized, and the British government did very little to date to ensure the repatriation of these funds. To deflate the intense international pressure, the British demanded that Nigerian authorities first initiate prosecutions at home and then provide credible proof linking the accused to the assets. In December 2003, after considerable pressure, the United Kingdom returned a sum of £3 million to Nigeria. The action was made possible by the conviction in a Swiss court of Yuri David, who was one of the financiers of Tony Blair's Labour Party, for laundering millions of US dollars for the late Abacha. This was followed by an announcement by the British Foreign Office Minister Chris Mullin during a visit to Nigeria that the British authorities had discovered in British banks about £30 million smuggled out of the country by Abacha. However, this declaration was not matched by any action. The actions of the British government not only denied Nigeria the vital resources for development, but they also indirectly fueled impunity amongst Nigerian politicians who have continued to route and transfer public funds to the United Kingdom and other countries that make it easy to store their loot. A case in point is James Ibori. The $30 million still sitting in the UK is yet to be returned, along with $144 million in France and a further $18 million in Jersey at the time of this recording. In total, Nigeria has over the past 18 years recovered $4.6 billion. However, there are concerns that the funds so far recovered may have been relooted or mismanaged by those at the helms of power in Nigeria. According to Transparency International, in 2006, $723 million was returned to Nigeria from Switzerland, but was largely unaccounted for. Well, as the emphasis is put more on Abacha's theft, a lot of attention should be focused on the countries and banks that willingly took part in helping him to store his stolen loot, because all these are complicit and enablers of African kleptocracies. I also believe that Nigeria was ripped off by these banks, in that if the money stolen was $5 billion, it surely can't be $5 billion 25 years later. These countries and banks used that same money to make profits, which is a much bigger rip-off and theft than the protagonist of our story. Truly, well, as they returned the money, they had made enough profit out of it to be comfortable to return it with strings attached. Therefore, African countries should hold Western tax havens accountable if they are to avoid all such kinds of heists. However, this is hard because these are the same countries our leaders run to for financial aid, and they are the same leaders that we are asking to hold these people accountable. I know it is a long shot, but times are changing, and responsible leaders are starting to emerge on the continent who are up to the task. When I started the story, I said that Abacha was the greatest of all time. Well, wait until you hear the story of Ibrahim Babangida's billions.